The stream is live. And hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies with Christiana Ellis. That's me. And Mike Mateen.
Yeah, that's the thing. And I'm Mike Mateen. Sorry, it didn't go as smoothly as I normally am used to. It was
That's
just
all
a little
right.
different.
Well, yeah. I don't always say it exactly the same way every time. So, as we are here to talk about our journey through the American Film Institute's top 100 movies. And we're going to do that. I think, as we're recording live, we can just briefly acknowledge that there's a lot of crazy stuff going on out there, but we're going to have this be not about that, but hope, we're aware it's happening. It's just, this is a break for anyone who needs one.
Yep, because we really can't go anywhere now. So
Yeah. So, we have been making our way through the list, and we have made our way quite a journey. It's been quite a journey. But we're coming in on the home stretch now because tonight we're talking about number 16 on the list, Sunset Boulevard, and then number 15, 2001, A Space Odyssey. And, we've been saying for a while now, probably like the last 15 movies or so, how increasingly it just gets to a point where all of these movies are just really good. But it just seems like that keeps happening. But let's talk about these movies. So let's start with number 16, Sunset Boulevard, the 1950 drama about an aging Hollywood silent film actress and the it's weird. Like, I'm trying to, like, becomes the sugar mama, so to speak, of a self-loathing young writer, and it is about their awful codependent relationship, kinda, and also about Hollywood, kinda, and I don't know. Is that a good description?
yeah, I don't know. It's kind of about all those things. I mean, it's pretty
Yeah.
meta. This is one of I'm not sure it's not the first like truly meta movie, but it is from as pop culture goes. Like, and what I mean is, it's a movie about kind of the dichotomy between the star and the writer, and that's why they end up in this codependent relationship because like he's underappreciated and she was so big, and now that she's not, that she's older or washed up, like she's useless. He has lost his enthusiasm for writing creative stories and is just trying to get a job done now because he's tired of dealing with the studio execs and made him super cynical. And then, but, it's done by Billy Wilder, who started off as a writer and then became a director because he was tired of not getting the recognition that he felt like he deserved as a writer. So the underappreciated writer is very meta. Like it's not autobiographical, obviously, because he didn't die that way. But it is about that, and it's about how he felt like he was getting cynical because he started to just do the job, and he had to become the director in order to do the real creative things. What's her name? Gloria Swanson, I think.
Yeah, Gloria Swanson as
Gloria Swanson was actually a silent film star, and now she's playing the washed-up silent film star. Like, again, it's just so, it's done as film noir, but it's noir about film. Like that's the dark part. The dark thing is the film industry.
Yeah. To be sure, I can't imagine that it was the first movie about Hollywood and the movie industry, but certainly it was before that was kind of a played concept. And it was sharp enough in its cuts that there were a lot of actual Hollywood personalities who were not happy about it. that they felt like it was actually kind of mean spirited and insulting and offensive about the movie industry at the time. Um, Even though a lot of the things in it we sort of take for granted today, not as good things, but that everybody knows that. Like the way that Hollywood kind of disposes of women as they get older, and they age out of their young leading lady range, and then Hollywood kind of doesn't know what else to do with them. And
Yeah.
I think that that's maybe less true than it used to be, but not true.
Yeah, I mean, you have to possess a different skill set,
Mm-hmm.
to continue on, you know, past, your prime, whatever star years.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's well, this one, so I'll kind of back up here because something I wanted to say about this is
Sure.
that this was one of the ones, actually both this and 2001, were of the thing that like all these movies are really good. Like I recognize that these were good movies. I didn't have as much enthusiasm about watching them.
Mm-hmm.
2001 we'll get to because obviously that is a super unique experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but this one, I don't know. I just again, just the fact that it was sort of noir-y meta Hollywood thing just didn't excite me. And then I sat down to start watching it. Like I made myself sit down to watch it, and I was blown away by how really, really good this movie is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of, I think, why it cuts so hard on people is that not only did he tell a very direct story, but he told it in a really, really interesting way.
Yeah.
It sounds like a detective movie, even though our protagonist is just an angry writer.
Right.
And William Holden, and again, the writing is some more irony with this. Part of the greatest thing of this movie is that the writing is so good. Like the whole movie is made by William Holden's voiceover.
Hmm.
I mean, the plot is good and all that, but what I feel like made me really enjoy it was his, just his metaphors and his all these things that he's bringing into his descriptions of things, like through this whole thing. Like he's so good and it's writing so tight on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really found myself just fascinated and wanting to hear what he was going to say next about whatever situation.
Yeah. So, how responsible do you think this movie is for first-person narration, voiceover, to becoming such a hacky trope over the decades that followed?
See, I wasn't sure which was the cause and effect. Like, I wasn't sure if this movie was taking something that already existed in a way and was putting it to its own device.
Well, I am sure that it was not the first movie with first-person voiceover narration. It was probably somewhat inventive, at least in the cleverness of it being post-mortem.
Yes.
We that's interesting, and I'm not sure I can think of another movie that did that before this one. Um,
So I have a question for you about that when you
sure.
finish.
Well, I was just gonna say, um, I don't think that it was like the first movie to do it, but I don't think it was like a jab at it exactly. You know what I mean? Like I don't think it was satirizing an overcommon trend of it at the time. I think it's more a matter of it just did it so well and became so iconic doing it that everybody who wanted to write a movie like Sunset Boulevard for the next 50 years did so. Used first person voiceover narration and tried to come
Yeah,
up with some
I would
clever
agree with
way.
that. Yeah, I don't feel like it was satirizing it either. I think what it was doing was taking again that film noir detective genre and using the trope that existed already in that,
Hmm.
and then applying it to what they wanted to apply it to, which then made it transcend just detective movies. You know. So, question about the postmortem thing: Were we as the audience supposed to know that from the beginning? I know they show us his body, but we hadn't seen him in person yet. He's
Hmm.
floating in the pool and he doesn't really look like himself. and it cuts away very quickly. And he never, I don't, as far as I could tell, it never really addressed that he was the body we saw until he gets shot. And maybe I'm
Well,
wrong, but that's why I'm asking. Yeah.
now it is interesting because I feel like it does, but in a very oblique way that is not super obvious. Like it would be really easy to miss it, and the movie doesn't seem particularly concerned with making sure that you know, because essentially it's actually off the top of my head, I can't remember 100% how the line is phrased, but I think it may actually be during the in the pool from below of the body, floating in the water. It might be during that shot where he says, "The irony is, I always wanted a pool."
That's at the end, though.
Are you sure? I'm pretty sure at the beginning he says something. He says that.
Okay, he might, but I rewatched the last like 10 minutes before we
Okay.
talked,
Yeah.
and he does definitely say that. Like he goes, yeah, the irony is this is the pool I always wanted.
Yeah. Well, I
Or he might have mentioned that at the beginning too. I'm not saying he
well,
didn't.
where I
Yeah.
started to question myself was I feel like it's possible that he says it in third person at the beginning. Like, poor guy, he always did want a pool or something like that. I can't
Right,
remember.
that sounds about right actually, which I think is why I was questioning
Yeah.
whether it was trying to not obfuscate completely that
Right.
it was him, but to your point, not make it obvious that unless you just really paid close attention and recognized him,
Yeah.
you don't necessarily know through 95% of the movie that he is dead at the end.
Right. I think it's something that the movie sort of expects you to infer without actually telling you, and some of it might just be reliant on the audiences of the time being able to immediately recognize William Holden's voice. And then when William Holden shows up and there's no other character
Mm,
that's like that, you know what I mean? Like I wonder about that too because I actually had the same reaction watching it of just saying like I know that it's him, but they really don't make that clear at the beginning. Like I feel like the clues are there if you already know, but if that wouldn't have been your first guess, it doesn't make it clear for you. You really
right,
kind of have to just start putting it together over the course of the story that like there's no one else that they're talking about, so who else could it be? You know.
right.
But maybe actually that was kind of part of how it was supposed to feel is like the surprise that like oh it was this tricky post-mortem narration all along and you didn't even realize. I don't know, maybe that was part of the idea, but I feel like none of the commentary talking about it now talks about that because the assumption is that everybody knows that already.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, I was curious and thought it was
Hmm.
interesting because I wasn't sure. That was good
Yeah.
perspective. So,
Yeah, so I want to circle back a little bit to just general impressions because it's interesting that that was your reaction only because mine was a little bit of the flip of that in the
hmm,
sense that not that I didn't like it, like watching it, or didn't love it, or don't think it's a great movie because I all of that is true. I do like it. I think it's a great movie, so on. But I did feel a little bit while rewatching it that unlike some other movies, I feel like it has suffered a little bit of just by virtue of being so heavily aped and referenced and copied in the decades since, right? Crazy influential, but in such a way that all of its best bits have been done to death now in other things. And I feel like to some extent that sapped it of its power a little bit for me. And
I can see that.
you still have to
Yeah.
give it the credit for being the inspiration, but it didn't feel to me quite as powerful as I was sort of expecting to find it rewatching it because I had seen it before, so I wasn't it wasn't new um, exposure to the story or anything, but it's also just something that has had a million parodies and copycats and that sort of thing. You know what I mean? It's like it's almost like a genre. You know what I mean? Just the sort of noirish satire, often about Hollywood. You know what I mean? It's just like there's I don't know. I mean, I guess it's not that there's like lots of movies that are just exactly like it. For one, it never got remade apparently because there were I don't know if it's like one of the trivia bits was that Billy Wilder kept telling people that he didn't have the rights to like he couldn't give them permission to remake it because he didn't have the rights. But I don't know if that's actually true um, or if it's just he didn't want them to remake it. Um, but yeah, I guess I just feel like almost everything that happens in this movie is its own page on TV tropes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like I love it. I think it's great, but I did feel that a little bit while watching it this time.
Yeah, and I can definitely see that. I think that the reason I didn't feel that as much, even though it's definitely there, was I just wasn't I just wasn't prepared for how good William Holden and that writing was, and it really drew me in, and so it wasn't like all the things are good about, and that's why I was trying to say like the what happens in the story is good, but I didn't love it watching it again this time because of the commentary on Hollywood and the writer and all those things that you said, and some of the things like you said, the tropes that have maybe lost some of their value because of being
Imitated.
intimidated, not intimidated,
Imitated.
imitated,
There you go.
imitated.
Yeah.
Sorry, um, it that it was just so good and immersive for me
Hmm.
that I was still drawn into the movie even without the power of all those other things that I agree with you on. Um, I just I just thought it was so clever, and I was trying to think like I was going to go back and like actually try to find some of the because none of it's really one-liners. It's just
Hmm.
like there's just this constant thing of like I mean he references like again like these he brings in like classical literature into like comparing it into these situations, and he just the way it ebbs and flows with his descriptions of what happens is it is like the line of like the irony is I always wanted a pool like this.
Hmm.
There's just always a cynical cleverness to everything,
Yeah.
and William Holden's voice is very very good for this as well. That it just yeah I was really really impressed with it. Yeah.
Well, what some of what you're talking about there just reminds me that sometimes one of the great joys of revisiting a classic like this is discovering a new appreciation for some element that you hadn't really thought as much about before. Like I think although William Holden is great in it, I think that the sort of the more flashy role for sure is Norma Desmond, played by Gloria Swanson, right? Like she is this aging film star descending into madness, and so she's very, arch and very close to camp in places, but I think it's one of the things that I think makes it such an amazing performance is that it never quite goes over that cliff, right? She's clearly larger than life, but in a way that feels genuine to the character and not like Gloria Swanson hamming it up.
Right.
And there's
And the only
always
time it
that.
really gets like close to that line is at the end when it makes sense.
Right, yeah, when she is going over the cliff, the character
Right.
is going over the cliff. And there's always this, like, one of the perfect examples of this is the bit where she is entertaining him by dressing up as the little tramp, Charlie Chaplin's character, right? Because on the one hand, she's pretty good. It's a pretty good
Yeah.
impression and it's funny to watch. But the music is discordant, and part of that I think is like on the one hand I felt like the music being discordant there, like like a broken calliope, was felt almost a little bit mean because she is actually pretty good. But I think part of what's going on there is even as she's doing this pretty good impression, you can see it just in the eyes a little bit of, oh God, please, he has to like this because I'm putting myself way out there, and if this is bad, then it's very bad. But if it's good, then I'm great and I'm a genius. But he has to like it, because if he doesn't like it, then I'm making a fool of myself. And if I'm making a fool of myself now, then how long have I been a fool? Right? Like, so there, you feel like there's just that edge of that in the performance, even as she's doing a pretty good Charlie Chaplin impression.
Yeah, I mean, her performance is phenomenal. I wasn't trying to discount that.
Well,
That wasn't what drew me to the
oh sure,
movie.
no, that was I didn't mean to imply that. In fact, that was actually kind of my point. Is just that I feel like she often gets talked about more, but the fact that William Holden is his character. What was his character's name? Was it like Joe Gillis or something
John
like?
or Joe, something. Yeah, I
I
mean,
think
it's
it was
very,
Joe.
yeah, it was like meant to be very like
Yeah.
blah.
Right. So, but right, like, but he also is playing his own interesting, nuanced character that is so critical because, we talked a little bit about like the elements of Hollywood satire in this, but honestly, the satire is kind of incidental because the movie's really more like a character study, where the satire is just around the edges of the scenery. You know what I mean? Like it is that because the character is this aging film star, but the movie itself, the story is more interested in just the actual very interesting dynamic between these two people creating this codependent relationship with each other, right? Because and the fact that they speak so differently. Like one of the things that you were saying is like his lines are not just like all these one-liners. It's just like,
It's like a
this.
tapestry almost,
Yeah.
you know.
Whereas hers, like, she has all of these iconic movie lines. That's actually kind of what, like, made me think about the contrast is that, like, she has, like, three different lines that are on the top lists of most memorable movie lines ever. It's like, you used to be big. And she says, I am big. It's the pictures that got small,
Yep.
right? We didn't need dialogue. We had faces. And then of course,
Ready for my
Miss,
close up.
yeah, which is another perfect example of one like in Casablanca, where technically the way people mostly remember that is actually wrong. They say it wrong. They say, "I'm ready for my close up, Mr. DeMille," but that's not what she says in the movie.
Yeah.
So, but nonetheless, I mean, like it's these big, dramatic pronouncements of lines. But that fits her character. That's the way Norma talks, which is different from the way Joe talks, which again is good writing from Billy Wilder.
Yeah. And let's look. We would be remiss if we also didn't talk about, if you're talking about contrast, the young writer, the girl
Oh
character,
yeah, Betty.
is,
Betty.
yeah,
Yeah.
critical, yeah, to really highlighting because
Yeah.
she contrasts to both of them.
Mm-hmm.
She's the much more level-headed female, and not, so she kind of counterbalances and makes Norma look even more
Mm-hmm.
extreme. She's also the enthusiastic writer who still wants to write good stories and wants to
Mm-hmm.
do good things. You can't understand like why he's so cynical and why he's writing,
Yeah.
movies about baseball that everybody can predict.
Well,
Like
right.
whatever
Like
the script was. Yeah,
she is introduced tearing apart the script that she doesn't realize that he's the writer of. Like,
right.
he's meeting with some producer he's trying to sell a script to, and then the producer calls her in and says, "Hey, what did you think of this script?" She doesn't know that he's the writer. She just says, "Oh no, no, it was pretty awful. It was very predictable and boring." And just, well, gee, you tell me what you really think. And I love too following that with the scene later at the party where she is having to sort of lead into. Actually, there was this one very small part of that story that I actually thought was really good and worth developing. Not the rest, but that part. and and yeah, she's just got this sort of earnestness about her at the same time that she's not naive.
Yeah, that's what I like the most about her, is that she wasn't how you could have written that character a very with a different edge to it. You know, the naivety. You know, she is very smart. She's very logical, but she's very enthusiastic and very um, she wants to do the right things, and
Mm-hmm.
he does too, but he's kind of given up on it, which is how she kind of contrasts and shows that in him.
Right.
You know, and then same thing, she contrasts like because she's not so flashy and over the top, like she contrasts with Norma. So she's very good in like helping us understand even more how these two got to where they are and why it's so ridiculous that they're in this,
Yeah. Well,
um,
what I think is,
relationship.
yeah, I think what she does so well, because I mean, it's good writing that she's a character at all, because you're absolutely right that my my lamp keeps flickering at me. That like her purpose in the story is to be kind of like a mile marker that shows Joe how far he is sunk
Yep.
in his relationship with Norma, right? You know, it's like the whole idea is that, so for anyone who hasn't seen this movie, you should watch it. But like, so, we meet him learning that he has written stuff that he took more pride in, but it hasn't been making a living at it very well. And so he has started trying to write the sort of cynical crap that he thinks people will buy, only to discover that people don't want to buy that either. Only now they don't even tell him, like before, it's like, hey, yeah, it's really good. It's a shame no one wants to make that movie. Now it's like, no, we still don't want to make it, and it's bad. And so he's having a rough time. He's literally having to, speed down the street to avoid having his car repossessed. And so that's how he ends up meeting Norma, is because he literally pulls into her driveway to get away from these repo men who want to steal his car back. And the thing is too that like these are some aggressive repo men, because they're basically implying they're going to break his legs too, right? Like, I mean, they're suggesting like, no, we're going to take that car, and maybe we're going to beat you up too, just for fun. Like that, it's kind of aggressive there. But so he's then immediately as he falls into this relationship with Norma, where like in theory he's helping her edit this screenplay, but he knows it's terrible right away. So he knows from day one of the job that he is basically just taking her money. Right? He knows that no one's ever going to make this movie. I mean, he maybe lies to himself a little bit, because she still gets so much fan mail. She says she calls Cecil DeMille on the phone. I don't know, maybe. But he's reading the script and saying, this script is written by a crazy person. No one's ever going to make this movie. And even if they did, she wouldn't be the right person to cast. So he knows that, but he doesn't say that to her because he wants to take her money. He enjoys living at her big house. He enjoys all the expensive gifts she buys him. And the problem, of course, is that he, for a while, is more successful at lying to himself that that's what he's doing. And even as, she's falling in love with him in her fashion. I think it's interesting to question, like, how much does she really love him at all, and how much is it really just she is desperate for the idea that a young man could find her attractive.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that can be answered just in what's the context of the movie. I mean, I think it's sort
Yeah.
of one of those things with it that you get the feeling that that's really what it's driven on. That his relationship with her is this cynical exploitativeness,
Mm-hmm.
and her relationship with him is that she's just narcissistic and loves that he gives her attention
Right.
like she wants. But it doesn't ever come out and say that's what that is. Like it just,
Mm-hmm.
you're left to take it either way,
Well, yeah,
and
she's so narcissistic. We have to imagine that, like, especially once we learn uh, some of her other stuff that she's got going on, like, because of course, it's early on when he can kind of say, well, I don't know, maybe she gets all this fan mail. She still has the big house and the fancy car. I don't know, maybe. I mean, I guess I'll do what she wants, and then it's her business whether she sells it or not. I'll be out of here. Like once it gets to that point, I'm cutting loose. But then when it comes to the night of that big New Year's Eve party, he really can't sort of lie to himself about it anymore, and he sort of panics about the idea of it not just being that he is sort of soaking this rich woman for her money, and now it's something else. Uh, when she basically confesses to loving him. But it's such a fascinating moment when we see that he's so easily fitting back into his lifestyle with the party, of his older friends and seeing Betty there again. And you can see there's this part of him that has been longing for that, right? Like it feels like, oh God, thankfully, a return to normal. But then when he hears on the phone, oh, Norma tried to kill herself, like that's a decision point for him, right?
right,
Because I mean, it's one thing for to be concerned about a fellow human being that he does have some complicated feelings for. Like he doesn't hate her quite, like it's and he feels at least somewhat responsible. So on the one hand of not wanting her to have died or to try to kill herself again is one thing, but going back and staying and essentially agreeing to the romantic relationship part that she has asked for, that is him sort of damning himself, so to speak, in the literary sense, right?
yes,
And it is at that point too where like it's later he has he reconnects with Betty and she wants him to help her write this other script, and she is presenting this alternative to the decay of Norma Desmond, but he is finding, even as she tempts him away with a more normal sort of existence, he's kind of stuck there now, in not as in it's a prison, but it's a self-made thing. He's comfortable there now. It's easy. He likes it. So even though it's tempting, this idea that, like, oh, I could actually work hard on something with people I find intellectually stimulating and could and attractive, and maybe go back to having a normal life, but then I could also just stay here at this rich lady's house and let her buy me fancy gifts, and and it's like that's the call he makes, right? He tells Betty to leave.
yep,
And on the one hand, we could. Well, I was just going to say, let's talk about it. I was going to say we could talk about this. Let's talk about it. Do you think it is a heroic decision what he tells Betty, or is it just him being a coward?
no, there's nothing heroic about what he does. I don't feel, at least,
Okay.
you
Well,
know.
so yeah.
I feel like he's supposed to be like this tragic figure, and
Mm.
and this is, and so is she. I mean, they're both tragic in their own ways,
Mm-hmm.
and and I feel like this is that climactic point where, like you said, it's a decision point for him,
Mm-hmm.
where we realize that he's lost.
Mm-hmm.
He's now gone down this path, and it's he's just being a coward. He's just taking this and being stuck in it, and all of the enthusiasm from the younger girl or whatever, like, it just, he's not, even though he shows these flashes of it when he's with her,
Mm-hmm.
like, he's too far gone,
Yeah.
and that's what I feel like that's showing us. At least that's how I
Right.
took it.
Well, I think what's just slightly nuanced about that whole sequence is that he doesn't, it could be framed as a choice between Betty or Norma, but he essentially actually chooses neither, right? Like he tells Betty to go away, lying to her about what's really going on, but then also plans to leave Norma, which is of course why she shoots him.
Right.
So
Yeah.
so
I
I'm
guess
I
I
was
never really bought that he was actually going to leave her.
hmm
That it was, but again, we don't get the resolution to that. I
right.
felt like it was talk, but
Could be, yeah. I mean, because the whole thing was, I think he had gotten so comfortable there, and that it was her, like Betty, tempting him away from it, and him realizing how sort of far he had sunk. Um, that he wouldn't have forced the issue, but then she actually, um, she pressed, right? Like she found his stuff that had Betty's name on it. Like, and so she found out what was going on and sort of was jealous, even though, although, he had been attracted to Betty, but he had also specifically kind of shut that avenue down at one point, right? Like she was making it clear she was interested, and he basically said, probably we shouldn't do that. I am definitely like, I, I'm not saying that I don't get it, but I'm not going to do that, Norma made the obvious conclusion, finding the stuff, and blew it all up, and was going to it almost reminds me a little bit of how in The Graduate, once Mrs. Robinson makes the ultimatum, that's where he decides to tell, um, God, what was the daughter's name?
Elaine.
Elaine. Yeah, that's where he decides to tell her, even though it blows everything up, right? And so I feel like it felt a little bit like that here, right, where he had been kind of content to let Betty be his Elaine while still going back to live with Mrs. Robinson, and to just let double, that double life go for as long as he could keep it that way. But then when Norma forces the issue, that's where he simultaneously tells Betty, realizing like he even if his intent is to leave Norma, he's not saying I'm going to go away with you, because I think at that point he's kind of so disgusted with himself that he's like trying to save her from him by trying to tell her something that will convince her to leave without him and not try to talk him out of what he's doing. Which is
Okay,
like
yeah, yeah. So I wasn't sure where you were going until you just got there. Yeah,
yeah.
so that's where you kind of could see him as heroic.
Well,
Yeah, it's interesting. No, sorry, keep going. I
yeah.
just had that sort
Oh,
of
sure,
washed over.
sure.
Yeah.
So I was actually not intending personally to say that I think it's heroic, so much as that's one possible read of his motives there.
Yeah.
Because I, first of all, would sort of tend to think like any part where he feels like he needs to lie to her for her own good is not a heroic decision, even if it's selfless in a way, right? Like what he thinks he's doing is protecting her, but it's kind of a disrespectful way to do that.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so like sending her away at the same time that in this argument with Norma, he's basically blown everything up, right? He reveals that all her fan mail is fake, that it's all a big fraud, that Cecil DeMille only wanted to know about the car. He says all this stuff, and I think at that point he's feeling like, how can you repair it after that? It's broken, like the bubble has popped.
Right.
we haven't even talked about Max, but Max is like responsible for like such this, I think, big kind of turning point in our understanding of the situation, because that's, Max introduced to us as just this stoic, stately butler that works for Norma and it does her bidding without question. And then only later do we learn that not only was he one of the great film directors of the silent movie era that directed Norma quite a few times, he was also her first husband of 3, and now he's her butler, forging all of her fan mail. And we learn this halfway through the movie when he's already, like when Joe is already in a relationship with her, and it's just this super creepy moment of like, oh God, this is so much more messed up even than we realized. So like that's where I feel like it's hard to imagine Norma as having any kind of a healthy, actual romantic interest. You know what I mean? Because like she's just so narcissistic that to not even really be able to think of Max in any other way except that, well, of course he's a man that fawns all over me, because who wouldn't? That
Yep.
sort of thing. But she needs Joe to do that too, or else it breaks the spell. Right? But it would if she were not so far gone, because of course she is desperate for that spell, so she recasts it if someone breaks it, so to speak, with her prepping herself even with the murder investigators downstairs, to come out and do the the staircase reveal, and all of the other people there, like Max directing the camera to like the news camera as she comes down to be arrested, and like it's such just this iconic sequence, right, where she is just fully gone, and the thing is, like, Gloria Swanson was only 50 when this movie was made. Like, she's not an old lady, right? And I mean, I think that's even like intentional in the movie. Like, she's not supposed to be older than that, right? And so it's really almost more just a matter of it is her own obsession that she, like 50 may as well be 100 to her, because what she wants is to be 23 again.
Right.
Yeah. I guess I just rambled a bit. I mean, there's so much we could talk about with this movie. Like, I mean, we kind of covered a lot of the themes. There's lots of just little trivia, like how Cecil DeMille plays himself, how like her bridge partners are all these famous silent movie actors, including Buster Keaton.
Yep.
That's kind of fun. The Hollywood tabloid gossip columnist that's talking about the fall of Norma Desmond at the end is an actual famous Hollywood gossip columnist at the time. And there's just a lot going on there, I don't know. What else should we say about it that we haven't?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like I've said what I wanted to. I covered kind of my impressions of it, what I liked,
Sure. Well, we could talk about like the awards.
Yeah, we could do that, like, to wrap it up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one of the notable, so it won for best writing, story and screenplay, best art direction, and best music. It was also nominated for Best Actor William Holden, Best Actress Gloria Swanson, Best Supporting Actor for Eric von Stroheim, who is Max, the butler / ex-husband. Best Supporting Actress for Nancy Olson, who played Betty. Best Director Billy Wilder, Best Cinematography, Best Film Editing, and Best Picture. So it got a lot of all the big nominations, but it didn't it didn't win nearly as many as it was nominated for. I was reading in the trivia thing about how the Best Actress she was up against in that year. Also nominated that year was Betty Davis in All About Eve, but and Ann Baxter in All About Eve. But who won was Judy Holliday for Born Yesterday, and there was a lot of talk about how Ann Baxter and Betty Davis and Gloria Swanson all kind of split votes from each other, and that's how Judy Holliday won. Which, I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't remember a thing about Born Yesterday. I'm pretty sure I have actually seen it, but
Yeah, I can't even remember if I have or not.
yeah. But we watched All About Eve earlier on the list, and Betty Davis and Ann Baxter were both great in that, right?
Yeah.
So like and then Gloria Swanson in this is one of like the iconic, actress performances like in all of cinema, right? And so, but to not have pulled that away. For the winner of Best Actor that year was Jose Ferrer for in Cyrano de Bergerac, and I don't actually think I've seen that version. Now that I think about it, but yeah, so lots of nominations, and it won a few, but not the big ones. The other there was some other thing I was going to just say about that, and now I'm blanking. Just I guess commenting that let's talk about how there are 4 Billy Wilder movies on this list. We've now watched all 4 of them. I feel like that's worth commenting on a little bit, right? Because so we have this one, which is the highest on the list, but we also have Double Indemnity, The Apartment, and what was the third one?
Virginia Woolf, is that him? No.
Gosh, why am I had it in my head just a little bit ago. Now I can't. Some Like It Hot. That's what it was.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, yeah, I know. That's how I was feeling like as soon as I couldn't say it. I was like, it was recent. Yeah. So I mean, one of the things there. So there's another podcast called Unspooled where they're also doing this list, and one of the things that they've kind of keyed in on when they talk about each movie is like, does it still belong on the list? And having some criteria on the basis of like a movie might be great, but if you start saying, well, okay, Billy Wilder has 4 movies on the list, does he need 4, or do we pick like 1 or 2 to be representative of Billy Wilder and make room for something else, right? And I don't necessarily think we need to have that conversation, but how do you feel about the 4 of these movies? Do you feel like all 4 absolutely desperately need to be on the list, or, what do you think about that?
I mean, Double Indemnity, I dropped all the way to 99, so
Yeah.
I would be okay if that fell off the list.
I certainly think that there are better film noirs on the list.
Right.
And I didn't drop it quite so low, but that might just be an affection for the genre. And not that it's bad. And then The Apartment is also just kind of this weird hybrid of got some of the slapstick comedy, but also some of the drama. And then Some Like It Hot is just the comedy, and now we've got this one, which is really mostly just the drama. So it's got kind of the whole spectrum of his of his work there.
Right, and they're all very different, which is, why I think it's okay that all 4 are on the list. I mean, I'm keeping this thing pretty high. I think this one it just delivers not only, I mean, I'm going to recognize it for the things that, also are part of its detracting, in that it is, it inspired so many other things in all these genres, but it is just so well put together, and it's just such a complete movie that it does belong up here. And like I said, The Apartment is very different. Some Like It Hot is very different, and it's, yeah. I don't think that if you said this is you could take this, which I feel like is his best movie on the list, and say this is representative of Billy Wilder. I feel like that would be not correct. this is a movie that is very much about Billy Wilder, but it doesn't. It's not the same thing. Like I think Some Like It Hot is probably a. I think if you had those two on here, if I like The Apartment, but if you drop The Apartment, and you drop Double Indemnity, and you had Some Like It Hot and this, because they're on the two extremes, that would be a representative of Billy Wilder on the list.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, that makes sense to me. All right. So, with Sunset Boulevard fading into the sunset, walking down the stairs that one last time, let's move on to movie number 15, 2001, A Space Odyssey, the 1968 Kubrick science fiction
Fill my drink while
saga.
You can give me the description.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, the movie has very little in the way of plot, which is not like a criticism really, because I'll talk a lot about how much I love this movie. But if you want to just say what happens in this movie, well, there's apes for a longer time than you probably remember if you haven't watched it recently. And then there's some people who discovered something weird on the moon. And then there's the part of the movie that most people actually remember, which is actually starts like an hour in.
Yes.
And then you have these astronauts who are on a mission, who are beset by their spaceship computer going crazy question mark. And then, hallucinogenic acid trip at the end.
Yes, such an acid trip.
And so there's in terms of just the story, that's really the whole story. I mean, you could talk about individual action beats within each of those sort of arcs, but that's really as complex as the story is. That's that's the log line of every act there. There's not really anything more you need to know about the story, because the movie is not really about the story. It's about the experience of the cinema, is the cinematic experience, right? This is a perfect example of something that really leans very hard into the sort of things that only movies can do. Right?
Yeah.
It's there are some movies where okay, well, okay.
Which is amusing because it's originally a book.
Not quite, actually. It's not
Oh,
quite
am
true.
I?
No, so what it was is that Arthur C. Clarke had a short story called The Sentinel that really all it was is the part of them finding a thing on the moon and it sends a signal. That's all it is.
Mm.
And then Clarke wrote the novelization while this movie was being made.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
So thank you for correcting me.
Well, it's a little bit of a back and forth, which is why it's there could be a lack of clarity there. But yeah, I mean, so there is a story. There's enough stuff that you can have there that you could write the novelization of the book. But I say this as someone who's read a lot of Arthur C. Clarke. 2001 is not the best one. I mean, it's fine, but I feel it's the movie compared to the book is very much like the Kubrick version of The Shining versus the book The Shining, in the sense that it's another Kubrick movie, right? Where the book has a story, and there is a story there, and you can follow it, and you're inside the heads of the characters in a literary way. But that's really not what the movie is interested in, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, so I guess I
didn't mean to. Yeah, I did not
no,
mean to
no,
derail that. I didn't know that. So.
No, that's all right. We're having a conversation. So now you do. But I think the thing about this movie, though, is almost more than any other movie on the list, certainly more than any other movie on the list that I really love, is one that I don't casually recommend that people watch. If someone who has never seen it comes to me and says, I've heard 2001 is really good, should I watch it? I would hesitate. Like, I would say, yes, but don't just put it on a Saturday afternoon while you're doing something else. That is a way to find it utterly boring and never revisit it and think that people are crazy for liking it.
Yes.
Um, and yet, what's also, I think, a mistake is sitting down with it, giving it your full attention, and saying, all right, 2001, impress me. Because it's not interested in telling a story in the same way that modern science fiction movies do, right? Like, you have to really be in a mindset where you can let this movie tell you it do its thing at its own pace. Because if you're too impatient or too distracted, either way, it's a fairly narrow range where you got to just be right there, which is one of the reasons I think why so many people found that it was a good experience stoned.
Yes. I mean, my dad used to tell me stories about that, like how people would just get like stoned, like lay in the aisle of the movie theater for the final like 30 minutes.
Yeah. Well, and like I think it's kind of fascinating in that sense that I think when people joke about getting stoned to watch the end of 2001, I think that like the surface level joke there misses the element that I was kind of just talking about, which is that it is best enjoyed in a fairly narrow mindset of being willing to be patient and let it come to you, and yet also able to think the deep thoughts it wants you to think.
Right.
Which is kind of like that's sort of a thing that pot can do, is put people in that frame of mind, which is the perfect zone for this movie. Like, and that's not going to be the same for everybody. I watched it without indulging myself and loved it, but at the same time, I think that's one of the reasons it kind of got that reputation as being a stoner movie, is because, you know, that puts you in that frame of mind where you can really appreciate what it's doing.
Right. That whole like kind of the joke of the whole, whoa.
Mm-hmm.
Like that movie, there's a lot of whoa in that movie,
Yeah.
even when you're not stoned.
Right. But at the same time, I've talked to a lot of people who tell me, like, I hated that movie. It's super slow. The sound design is crazy annoying. Like, there's just these long sections where there's nothing but these irritating beeps just going for 15 minutes. And, like, that's true, right? Like, it's hard to argue with that.
No, I'm just laughing because I watched this when Abby was taking her final classes, on like Tuesday or on weekday nights.
Mm-hmm.
I put it on one weekday and said, hey, can I watch this movie? Like, I'll be upstairs, but, and she's like, no, yeah, I mean, you can watch stuff upstairs. Like, it doesn't really bother me. And then a couple hours into the movie, like, she texts me and she's like, this movie is so annoying. And I was like, I thought you couldn't really hear the movies when you're down there. She's like, it's got some really annoying sounds that are making it all the way down to my office.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, yeah, it's all that beeping and shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that thing was literally, that criticism happened for me in the watching of this movie.
Oh, yeah. Like, I don't think I've had a single conversation with someone who didn't like it where that was not part of what they hated. And I could get that. So I could imagine that for some people who, just like everybody's hearing range is just a little different, right? Like, I could imagine there are people who just find that so unpleasant to listen to that it just like takes them out of the movie entirely. I could envision that happening. Now, like, fortunately, it's not that case for me, but like, I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like the other thing too is, it's kind of, I made a joke about it earlier, but like, The whole part with the apes is way longer than I think most people remember when they haven't seen it in a while.
Yeah, like they just remember that like the thing lands and it helps the apes evolve.
Yeah, but that's like 20 minutes of the movie.
Right. Which I just described everything that happens in that 20 minutes.
Well, right, like, and that's kind of what I was talking about earlier too, in the sense that like there's very little plot in the movie because it really takes its time getting those beats, right? So we spend time seeing first what is life like for these proto humans, like what are they, how are they currently getting by? Well, like they want water, but the nearest water hole is kind of lorded over by this other tribe that's chases them away, and then they're always scared at night because there's predators, and they're having to scrounge for food, and it's really hard. But then one day they wake up, there's this crazy thing there, right? A monolith. And it's such a cool iconic image, right? Like just this perfectly, smooth right angles black thing that's just in the middle of all of that, rocky and, the hairy ape costumes they got the actors in, which is interesting actually because on the one hand, like they don't look like actual apes or gorillas or anything, but of course they're not actually supposed to be. They're supposed to be proto-humans, and so the idea that it's humans in a costume actually kind of works, right? Like it
Yeah,
doesn't
it does.
like it the costumes are not they're not bad, but they're also like, like modern special effects can do better. But at the same time, in terms of them moving like you know, uh, physical actors, I was gonna like physical actors feels like a weird thing to say, but like people like Doug Jones today or Andy Serkis, right? Like the people who like
Yeah.
make their living doing that kind of strange movement for motion capture or whatever, right? Like I watched one of the special features on my Blu-ray that was just talking about like they hired a bunch of dancers and had them study like all sorts of ape footage to like learn how to do the movements they're going to do. And so but it plays well. Like I think it works. And like
Yeah.
yeah, and so they find this thing, and then life goes on. The thing goes away. It doesn't stay there. And but then one of them has this idea. He's just kind of sort of seeing these bones one day, and he starts kind of playing with one. Starts realizing, and he's crushing stuff with it, and we realize very effectively with no actual dialogue or explanation or anything, but what we realize just through the visual storytelling is this crazy thing has done something to them to allow them to make this leap into becoming tool using.
Right.
And then we see how that changes their life. They can kill these little weird tapir things. They can fight off the other the other proto-humans at the watering hole, and then we have like the classic shot where it throws the one up in the air and then it becomes like this. One of the things that I also learned in a special feature is that this is something that's not really made obvious in the movie, but what's intended is that satellite that it sort of turns into in the match shot is actually supposed to be like an orbital bombardment, like war satellite. And so the idea is the weapon turns into another weapon. Because it's definitely not the same space station we see them going to in the next bit. But like it doesn't really explain that's what it is, and there's really no way we would have to know that that's what it is. They just have to say, well, that's what we were intending, but it just never actually came up, and it wasn't really that important anyway. So
Yeah.
I will say, for being such a classic, iconic shot, and me loving it in principle, it always strikes me as just a little bit weird that the edit isn't perfect there. You know what I mean? Just like given Kubrick's reputation and all, why is it that we see the bone going up and then kind of a cut and then more bone and then cut to the space station? And I'm like, why isn't it a perfect match?
Yeah, I never thought about that.
I mean, because it's like if this was a sloppy director of saying, "Oh, sure, that's fine, just move on," then sure. But this is Kubrick. Like, I can't imagine it not being on purpose, and yet I don't understand why it's like that. And
Hmm.
I've never read anywhere else where people talk about that, so I don't know.
I'm not saying it's just you. I just hadn't.
You know what I mean, though, right? Have you
I
know?
100% know what you mean now that you
Yeah,
called attention to it. I think I'd always just written it off as like it was a movie made in the 60s and sort of taken the Kubrick part out of it.
yeah,
Um, so,
yeah.
yeah,
If it was
yeah,
anyone else but Kubrick, I would say,
you're
"Oh,
right.
sure,
You're right.
that
Like,
it just yeah."
yeah,
It would be a hard shot to get. They didn't get it quite right. They decided to not spend all day with it. But Kubrick had like a reputation for making people do take like 67 takes of things. So,
interesting. Yeah.
and especially since like all you would have even really needed is not having it have a cut. You know what I mean? Like just I don't know. Anyway, I have no answers there. It just like it's one of the few things in the movie where I kind of just squint my eyes a little bit and say, but why is it like that? I don't know. But that, of course, brings us to the next phase where we get. I think my. Uh, I was just gonna say it's one of my favorite scenes in the movie, but like, there's just so many things in this movie that I just absolutely adore. But the space plane going up to dock with the space station to the Blue Danube, and
Yeah.
rotating, like it's just uncannily beautiful. It makes me like tear up every time I see it.
It's so beautiful. Like, there's just the whole thing with, like you said, that it's a waltz, right? Blue Danube
Mm-hmm.
is a waltz. Yeah, and that's kind of what it's implying is that like how to make this work is almost a waltz between the two
Yeah,
space station. Like it is pretty good.
and this is pre Star Wars special effects, pre by 10 years, and
Mm-hmm.
they hold up today. Like, obviously, I think there are like it would look different if they made it today with modern effects, right? It wouldn't look the same as it does, but it like there's nothing about it that looks cheesy or fake. It's kind
Right.
of incredible, right? Like the innovation that George Lucas brought with Star Wars, which we're going to talk about the next episode, right? It's one of the next two movies, but like the big change there was not in just having it look real like there's a spaceship in space, because obviously Kubrick had done it. Other things had done that, but what he innovated was it just being able to be so fast in like a dogfight. You know what I mean? Like that's what was more different there. Whereas a lot of the shots of the spaceships here are either much more static or there's just a lot less movement in each individual shot. You know,
Right.
but at the same time, it's such a perfect example of how with effects, if you're able to use the effects with the right aesthetic style, it doesn't get dated, right? Like there's plenty of CGI even in great movies like Fellowship of the Ring, where you look at the cave troll now and you watch Legolas jumping up on the back of it and you go, ugh, not anymore, right? But this movie was made like 50 years ago. Is it 60 now? Wait a minute.
Now
No,
52.
50. Yeah, 52. Yeah. Suddenly it was second guessing my mental math there. But yeah, so and again, like, Star Wars got a lot of deserved applause for its innovation in effects, but that was 10 years later.
Yep.
And so I like and just the beauty of that sequence, even as some of the elements do get dated, but not the effects, just more like how it's a Pan Am space plane.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the other thing to remember about some of the depiction of people in space is that this was pre Apollo 11, right? Like, so, like, we hadn't been on the moon yet. And so some of that stuff, like just what's it going to look like with people eating food in zero G? Like, you know, the way they have it in there is that everything is just in these little suction pouches, you know, because well, otherwise it'll get everywhere. But what we know now is that that's actually not true. Only liquid things need to be in little pouches like that. Otherwise, you can just like you can still eat a sandwich.
Right.
But you know, it's like uh, lots of that stuff was just totally imagined because you know it was not influenced by NASA. It was the other way, almost. I mean, I guess that's not 100% true because, you know, like some of the Mercury and Apollo missions had happened already, but, you know, it was still, you know, pre moon landing, not post. All right. I don't know why my lamp keeps flickering like that. Sorry, I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking. Is there more you wanted to say?
I mean, you're super passionate about this movie.
I am. I am definitely very passionate about this movie. Um,
I'm just. I mean, I like it. I just don't. I'm not on the same level. I mean, I
mhm,
not, and it's not because there's anything wrong with the movie. I enjoy it. I think it's beautiful. I think it's well shot. I think it's
mhm,
entertaining if you're in the right mindset. Um, I think it's powerful. I think there's a kind of religious overtone that isn't always talked about that I think
mhm,
is really interesting to it. Of the, it's not saying that these monoliths are God by any way.
mhm,
Like it's not definitely not doing that. But
mhm,
it does plant that question of, you know, there could be things that basically it's the unknown. You know,
yeah,
we don't know how God works. We don't know how religion works, but we don't know how alien life works. And so could those things have worked together?
mhm,
There's no reason to say no other than, you
yeah,
know, and I really enjoy that it makes you kind of question that. And I love the final shot, which is essentially like, or I don't know if it's the final shot, but the basically where he becomes a baby again.
mhm, yeah.
Um, you know,
Star
and
Child.
it's right, yeah, but it's the implication is that the ultimate form of evolution is rebirth,
Mhm,
and that's very religious, obviously, but also very just interesting that
mhm,
like that was the final form essentially of the thing,
mhm.
is that, you know,
Or
you
at least the next one, right?
right,
Final in the
exactly.
movie.
It's final in this movie. I realize that there's a sequel and things, but
Well,
I don't know.
I,
I just
I
yeah.
think I think like 2010 is a fine movie, but it's in a totally separate category from this one in my
Mhm.
view. It is an ordinary science fiction movie that's fine. And it has elements that I like in it that are drawn from this one, but it's a very mundane sequel compared to the masterpiece that is this one, in my opinion.
Yes. So I've always really liked, outside of all the technical competencies that are there, the beauty of the movie, all the things you're talking about. There has always been this sort of meditative thing that I go into when I watch it, and
Mm-hmm.
it's part of why for me you have to be in the right mindset for it. It's not just because of the pacing. It's also the depth of thought of like questioning, because it's by no means saying that like God doesn't exist. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's not what it's trying to say. It's just posing this question of like all of these things are unknown, and so here's an alternative theory,
Yeah.
but it ends up in kind of the same place. And and the movie opens with evolution. You know, that's what the monoliths do. They help the apes evolve.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea is that every time the monoliths are part of the story, they are evolving us.
Right. Well,
And
and
again, like I said, the final evolution is to be reborn. You
right.
know, whether he's the kind of symbolic baby, but like just the whole thing is like, you know, it's like ashes to ashes, dust to dust. You
Hmm.
know, it's
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and on that note, like that's actually where the source material, like this original short story called The Sentinel, was all about, because like the concept from that story that became this movie is the idea that humans are exploring the moon, and we find this thing that seems to have been designed to send a signal and alert someone that humans have evolved enough to reach their own moon. And so of course that's what happens in this, is that they dig up this weird thing, and as they're investigating it, it sends a signal, which is what inspires the mission to Jupiter that the rest of the movie consists of.
right.
um,
That makes sense. Yeah.
yeah. So but it does leave that all unexplained, right? Like these monoliths are a huge mystery. We don't What are they? Who put them there? What's their larger purpose? All of that, like we see what they do, but it does imply the existence of, if not God, then a higher power of some kind,
Yep.
right? Now, like plenty of other movies have explored those ideas, like not just movies, but science fiction in general. Like, I mean, Contact comes to mind immediately, right? Because that's, the idea that these aliens have sent a signal to say, here's how to build this machine to come visit us, right? Like it's like there's lots of science fiction that explores some of that idea, but you're right that the way it's approached in this movie is that it explains almost nothing. It leaves you to ask those questions and infer the answers on your own, because the movie doesn't give you any of those answers, right? And it's all treated with this. There's a term that's sometimes used for science fiction and fantasy. It's usually more in books, but I've always liked it. And it's kind of an onomatopoeia of a word, but it's called sense of wonder. But like obviously it's like sort of like a sillified version of sense of wonder,
Yeah.
but it's meant to imply that sort of feeling that it's trying to evoke of, wow, that's amazing, right? And this idea that this is this incredible thing that implies all sorts of things about the universe that are so big, and that we couldn't possibly understand all of it, and yet we want to, right? And so having that all be in there is a big part of, like you said, this meditative, reverential quality that a lot of the movie has. And surprisingly, we have not talked at all yet about the part of the movie that most people think of as
How?
the movie, which is the Jupiter mission, and Frank Poole, Dave Bowman, and Hal, right?
Yeah.
And
Which it's a good transition because I feel like Hal is also part of, again, like the sort of this meditative religious journey that I go on when I watch this movie,
yeah,
because it's to speak about things that hold up. Hal is an AI in 1968,
yeah,
and how relevant that is, that question, because again, it doesn't say, it's not that Hal is bad, because
mm-hmm.
he can't be bad, he's just a computer.
Well,
But
yeah,
yeah, but there's this like, at what point, and this is, again, is explored in a lot of different ways, in the more positive way with like Star Trek and Data.
mm-hmm.
There's this like, how can an AI have human characteristics, and he's more empathetic. This is a more, some of the colder side of how can a AI start to have,
Yeah,
but still maintain the computer like progression of like, this is how things have to be done,
yeah,
but
but like
be making decisions. Yeah.
But what I think is an amazing stylistic decision is that, even as you say, like colder, like Hal expresses more vocal emotion than either Dave or Frank, right? Like, is very
Sure.
calm most of the time, but nonetheless still expresses more emotion through his various dialogue. His Hal, his, like, you know what I mean? Like, than either Dave or Frank, by design, right? Like, I mean, Kubrick specifically told the actors, like, no, I want you to be, like, you don't have to act like you are a robot, but I want very flat affect and, very calm, and, like, there's never a point where Dave or Frank raise their voice, even when Hal is literally trying to kill them. I mean, like Dave gets a little bit of urgency in his voice when Hal won't open the pod bay doors for him, but that's it. Right? Whereas, think of Hal pleading for his life as Dave prepares to disassemble his brain.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, it's. I was
You
just
know.
thinking about that. Like that was just, and it just echoes in your head. What,
Mm-hmm.
what are you? What are you doing, Dave?
Stop,
Dave,
please.
stop, please. What are you doing?
My
No, Dave, stop. Yeah.
my mind is going. I can feel it. I can feel it. Yeah, it's
Right.
like,
Yeah, and there's a
I'm
yeah,
getting
there's like
chills just talking about it.
right because you're
Yeah,
the whole time you're watching it, you're contemplating: is he killing him?
yeah, and like one of
Can
the
he kill him?
yeah, they introduce this subject matter, like this question. They introduce it to us in a very organic way, very early on in this whole sequence, where we're having the astronauts watch the news report of their own pre-departure interviews, right? And then, like, so that's how we meet Frank and Dave, is watching them watch themselves get interviewed before the mission. But then, they interview Hal, right? But one of the things that is brought up when, like, one of the computer experts talks about how advanced Hal is, and then they ask Frank and Dave about it, is this idea of, like, does Hal have emotions? And they specifically and explicitly bring up the idea that he acts like he does, so who can say, really? Right? And, like, even if all he's really doing is, by virtue of his programming, in order to interface with us, he is mimicking the affectation of emotion for a completely emotionless reason. That might be what's happening. But if we can't tell the difference, what does that mean?
Right.
And that's a fascinating question. And I think that I like that, just like with the monolith, the movie doesn't give us an answer to that.
Right.
Now, like, that's one of the things that I feel like is a little bit unnecessary in the sequels, is that they feel the need to try to explain why Hal went crazy. Which, I mean, like, it's an answer that, like, well, essentially what it is that, like, the explanation is that they told Hal, the mission is the most important thing. You have to get there no matter what. So you can't let, that's why he's saying, like, I can't let Frank or Dave, interfere with me, because I have this secret information that they don't have. But it was also somehow that conflicting with his programming to keep them alive, and it created, like, a feedback loop. And I just feel like that just takes all of the mystery out of it at the point, to the extent that it's like, well, what's even the point then? Like it does
Yeah.
it
I
that
like that it's a mystery.
what that is it's like saying that the answer to Hal is that he doesn't have emotions. He just acts like he does because of his programming. And just saying that like that's a fact, right? Like, okay, well, I mean, yes, that's one way to look at it, maybe, but we don't know really, and it's not very interesting to just declare it to be the answer, you know? But what I think is amazing in this movie, though, is that knowing later, once you know everything that's going on, you can literally identify the exact precise instant where things change, right? Because there's the moment where uh, Hal is talking to Dave and saying, I can't help but think that it's a little bit strange that they put some of the other scientists on already in hibernation. Don't you think that's strange? And like we can imagine that is him knowing the answer and feeling some degree of conflict about it. But then Dave kind of goes, you're working on my crew psych report, aren't you? And that's where Hal says, of course I am. Like, well, like, but again, it's a mystery. Like, is that what he was doing, or was there actually some desire of his own? Was he probing in a psychological way to see what Dave's reaction would be? And if so, was that because he's doing the psych report, or because he actually has his own sort of conflict about it? But then it is right after that.
What you said, like, does it matter?
Right.
Like, ultimately, does it matter? If he learned it from, like, because that's how we work too. Like, some of our emotions are built off of things that we read or experienced.
Yeah, yeah.
So if he's doing it the same way, is that wrong? Like, why is that? Because he just, is that less genuine than the way we do it? Even though we came, and this is again like super like meditative of, we came from two different directions. Like, we started off, and that's why the ape scene's important. It's like we started off as all emotion and survival and things like that, where he started off as all logic and calculation and things like that. We evolved to reasoning, logic, calculation. He's now evolving to emotion, personal decision making based on the information he has. And does that, again, so it comes back to could he die, or did he just get turned off, or does it matter?
Well, and then that's again why, like, oh well, in 2010 they just find the ship again and they power him back up and he's fine.
Which I hate. Like, I love leaving it with, is that a dead character, or is that just a turned off computer?
And again, like
I say it so cynically, but it's like it is something that you just like sit there and ponder for days after the movie, and it's like, and then you think about our current state and like AI, and it's like, I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah, well, because the truth is that on the one hand, on a human level, it's very easy to just say, he acts like he has emotions. It's frankly easier for us to treat him as though those are real. But it's also true that could superficially disguise a behavior that's actually very different. And when we use, when we identify emotion in other people, we're good at that because it's often predictive of behavior, and it's useful in that regard, right? But with AI, if it's just mimicking the emotions, it might not be predictive of the behavior at all.
Right.
And
it becomes essentially sociopathic in a way.
Or it could, at least, right? Like, that's where there's all this uncertainty. But I didn't quite finish the bit, though, because
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. No, that's all right. Like, I love all of this, so I'm just saying. But it is only after Dave kind of challenges Hal's motivations for asking that that Hal at that point is when he goes, just a moment. I have identified a fault in that sensor thing. And I love, first of all, that the repeated just a moment is definitely evocative of like a loading screen sort of thing, like processing, computing, but but naturalized in a way that is just a little off. Like the repeated just a moment said exactly the same way. Like you could kind of imagine a person saying it like that, but maybe not quite. And so I love that little tick. But that
It's
being,
so predictive because like that's how video game loading screens work now.
mm-hmm,
Like
yeah,
the whole thing is to disguise that the thing is loading.
yeah,
Like it
exactly.
used to be, you just sat there while the bar filled.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But now it's your character is walking on terrain,
yeah,
but what you don't realize is that's just a loading screen, and
yeah,
but you kind of feel it because it's not part of the game.
mm-hmm,
It's just your character walking.
yeah. Like I
But
feel like the last couple of years, one of the big ones they've added is, oh, your character has to squeeze through a tight passage, or they have to lift a heavy door. The Uncharted games were really big on doing that to kind of disguise a loading screen
oh
for
yeah,
new areas.
you're talking in-game loading screens. I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
talking like the pre-game even.
Oh,
Like the
yeah.
pre-game don't even use like it used to be that you understood there was an acceptance that you were in pre-game,
Mm-hmm.
so you had to load your game. But now they've even disguised that. Like
Yeah.
there'll be, if you're playing a sports game, there'll be some sort of weird crowd shot with like cheering while
Mm-hmm.
you pick something. When all it is just it's a veneer over the loading screen.
Right.
They don't want to show you the little tick 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 tick
Mm-hmm.
tick.
Yeah.
And when you recognize it, you still feel that way. But so it's super predictive. Again, 52 years later, we're still trying to disguise
Yeah.
computer loading. You know.
Yeah. And the so but like that moment being where this Hal departs from his counterparts on Earth, right? Because that's where he identifies the fault in the sensor, and then they go out and they check the sensor and it's actually fine. And the other computers are saying, why did you detect a fault? Our interpretation of the same data you have didn't lead us to make that conclusion. So that's where they start saying, it looks like Hal made a mistake. How can that be? If that has happened, does it indicate or foretell future failures or problems? What do we need to do about that? And that's where things, escalate, right? And the amazing moment where you realize Hal is reading their lips through the little, like they go through a lot of trouble to try to make sure that Hal can't hear them because they're not sure what he will do. And the fact that they call out and they say, rotate the pod, please, Hal. Rotate the pod. And he doesn't, which is how they conclude that he can't hear them because surely he would rotate the pod. But if he can read their lips, then that means he knew. He knew that they were trying to talk without him, and he didn't do it because he was lying to them, essentially.
Right.
Which,
And so again, just like it goes back to did he do that because his programming led him to a sequence of decisions based on hierarchy, or had he developed an ability to lie? And
yeah.
and again, the final question is like, does it matter? Like,
Mm-hmm.
because he still lied to them,
Yeah.
even if he was just a computer.
I feel
And
like, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I'm gonna shut these blinds while you keep
Okay,
talking.
sure.
So
I feel
give
like
me a minute. Yeah.
Hal is one of the most iconic, sympathetic monsters in all of cinema, in my opinion. And I say monster because the thing is, like, you could argue that it's maybe kind of sort of self-defense, except that they only do it because of his actions to begin with. Like, they're only starting that. But, like, look at the scene where they've gone back out to replace the sensor with this idea that, like, well, if it really has a fault, then we put it back and we let it fail, and then if it does, then we'll know that it was faulty and we'll have a better understanding of what it was that you detected in the first place. But even then, Dave and Frank are already suspicious. But this is where we have that long shot where you see the pod hanging in space as Frank has left it start to turn on its own to go after Frank. And that sequence is just like, if you're really there in the moment watching that, scene, like that's a horrific moment because like everything up to that has really just been talk from Hal.
Right.
But the talk and the suspicion and everything has now become murderous intent. And, you know, and I love too, probably driven by the special effects thing that we don't actually see what the pod does to Frank. We only see, like, we cut to Dave kind of realizing, hey, wait, what's going on? And we see Frank tumbling away, right? Like, and so, um, but you know that leading just to the sequence to that, and everything just tracks, right? Because we can see why Dave can't help but hurry because gotta go after Frank. And it's like, even though it seems obvious that like if his tether is severed, he's tumbling away, he's not responding on the radio, doesn't seem great, but he's definitely going to go after him anyway in the pod. And every second it goes by, he's further and further away. So that's why he's hurrying. That's why he gets into the pod without his helmet. That's why he doesn't, have it. And I will just say that, like, it's one of my personal pet peeves that people think that you can't, that if you're in vacuum, you just blow up. But, like, it's 1968. They knew. Because the actual science is that you would not blow up. You would have a very unpleasant minute and a half or so before you asphyxiated. But you would not instantly freeze. Your head would not blow up. But this, just the whole sequence leading up to, open the pod bay doors, Hal, and I'm sorry, Dave, but I can't do that. It's just like, it's such an amazing sequence. So, like, in that sense, like, in the sort of role that he's playing in the story, Hal is a monster. And yet, how can you not feel it when Dave is disassembling them? It feels like murder.
Right, because when you play that line, right down the fairway, just perfectly straight,
Mm-hmm.
he is doing monstrous actions, but he's a computer. So is he evil? Is he making evil decisions? We don't think he is.
Right.
He's making calculated decisions, but what makes that different? Again, why I brought up like sociopathy earlier, like it is the same as a human being who has disassociated from society and therefore does things that are what would be considered evil, but without evil intent.
For that
And
matter,
are they evil or are they just disassociated? Like, and does it matter? Like, because is the end result really what we should be focusing on? Like, it's such a great question, and I know we've talked about it on some of these other movies, like the idea of using the climax of a story to not just be like the end, but sort of the kind of turning point. And how a climactic scene can actually, exist very much earlier, like in Schindler's List when he sees the girl in the red coat. Like, even though there's still an hour left of the movie, that is the turning point of him just doing what was a good business decision into, I'm going to do this to help people. And it changes the course of the rest of the movie. Like, the Hal not opening the pod doors is like the climactic moment of this movie, because it is the tension and what it leads to, and like you said, like and Dave's response to it, and whether and the questions that we're taught, like we're going through, like talking through, like, is this okay? Is this not okay? Is Hal evil? Is he not evil? Did he kill him? Did he just turn him off? Like,
well, like,
and then just the wave of emotions, and then you go into that final sequence right after that where you just get like senses annihilated by all this stuff. It's a pretty intense experience.
Yeah. Well,
if you're into it,
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up on that, like, I feel like even so, on the one hand, if we want to just say Hal's just a computer, he's just following programming that has resulted in a complex, unpredictable outcome. In that sense, there's no evil there. There's no murder there. It's essentially the equivalent of an industrial accident, right? But even if we want to attribute some sort of consciousness or emotion to Hal, is it evil even then? Because after all, he only does it when he has been given reason to believe that they are going to disassemble, like disconnect his higher brain functions.
Right.
He doesn't know what that means. Essentially, you could argue that he's acting in self-defense.
Whoa.
Mm-hmm. Well, and like for that matter, they anticipate that reaction, right? Like that's why they have the conversation in the pod where they think he can't hear them, is if he is already acting differently than we would expect, nobody has ever disconnected a computer this powerful before. I don't know how he'd feel about it. I don't know what he'd think about it, I think is actually what he says. But,
yeah.
The implication is an assumption of emotion, right? It is, and so like if the idea is you think Hal is just a computer, if that's really what you think, then how would you ever conclude that he would try to stop you, perhaps with murder, from disconnecting him? Like you sort of have to already be thinking of him like a conscious entity, in order to draw the conclusion that he might object to being disconnected.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I agree though that like in a story arc, like diagramming the rising action and all of that, yeah, essentially that whole showdown between Dave and Hal is really the last decision that gets made in the movie. Everything else that happens after that is certainly like big and splashy and amazing and awe-inspiring and crazy and mysterious, but it all is really just like the outcome of everything that has just happened, right? There's never any, like, we don't have any scene there at the end where Dave is not sure what to do about this monolith that's here. We almost cut straight to, they have already arrived there and he is already going out to see this thing. So it's like, you're exactly right that the climax is that confrontation between Dave and Hal. That's resolved when Hal, or Dave finally disconnects Hal, and learns only then about like the information that was kept secret all that time.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The other bit that I was going to say, the horrific moment of Hal turning the pod around to kill Frank, is also like it's overlapped with him shutting off life support to the hibernating.
Oh yes,
right?
We didn't even talk about it. Like he killed everybody else too.
Yeah. And like that's where it's harder to attribute any kind of a rational motive to that, right? Other than just the idea that if he's killed one of them, he concludes that the others wouldn't let him continue operating after that, which
he goes into that whole self-defense, like but it's that 5 chess moves ahead. Like if they come to life and find out that I killed him, they're going to disconnect me, and I have to protect myself, so I'm going to kill them. And yeah, I mean, and again, it's like,
he plays chess with Dave earlier in the movie.
Yeah.
And wins. I think you missed it, Dave. Queen to knights 4 or whatever, and it's like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. That whole bit.
Yeah. It's heavy.
Yeah.
So
but,
I got maybe 5 to 10 minutes left before I have to go have dinner. So
okay.
not
so
to cut this off. I've enjoyed it.
That's all right. So like we can briefly address the whole end sequence. Like I think that there are people who try to actually find meaning in every individual little thing that happens in that, and I honestly think that's a waste of time. It's not about that.
No, I think it's designed to be like that. Like it's meant to be like, let's just come up with some shit. I mean, it's almost like the loading screens. Like, let's just find a way to like have 20 minutes go by of a bunch of stuff. Yeah.
Well, right, and it's supposed to just be this experience that carries you along. Now, that's not to say they didn't put some thought into it. Like, I watched a bunch of the special features that were actually made in the year 2001 for, for that, like when they made a bunch of things for it in the year that it was. So my Blu-ray has a lot of those features in it, and it's kind of fun watching that stuff because like, even that stuff's 20 years old almost now, you know. But one of the things that they talk about there is like the sequence where he is in that strange, weird, like apartment room. One of the things they emphasize there is that in a time is always moving forward sense, once we see the older version, we never see the younger version again. They use film tricks to do like the eyeline match of, we see Dave looking at something. What is he looking at? We look over and we cut to the thing he's seeing, which is the older version. And the older version looks back as though to be looking at the younger version. But then when we cut to what the older version is looking at, the younger version isn't there. And so we never, once we see an older version, we never see the younger version again.
Right, because it's an evolution.
Yeah.
Like the whole point of the thing is that he's evolving.
Right. But I just mean like they put thought into that, like to just kind of say like there's it's not just, hey, let's throw a bunch of weird stuff. It's like they put some thought into what was happening, even though I don't think we're intended to take any concrete meaning from any specific thing, like, why is he eating green beans? Like, it doesn't matter.
No, it's meant to be just him in a very common situation, like that's the idea behind it. It's like he's just there eating,
Yeah, it's supposed to feel strange and weird and uncanny and what's happening,
right.
and like that's the emotion they're going for, and it's not intended to be interpreted literally. I don't think.
No, it's the I've never looked up, by the way, this what I've always heard was a Hemingway quote.
Okay.
Have I told you about this one, The Old Man and the Sea?
Go ahead. I think you have, but go ahead.
So my understanding of the quote is like Hemingway was asked, hey, like what is the deeper meaning behind The Old Man and the Sea? Like what did you think about like the religious stuff and all that? What's it really about? And Hemingway said, it's about a guy who goes out fishing, comes back. And what his point was that he, like, what he was trying to say is, like, I told a certain story. Mm-hmm. You're left to interpret and put your meaning on it. Like, that was, and again, like, I have no idea if that's actually a real quote. I've never bothered to look it up because I actually don't want to be disappointed.
It's totally in line with his reputation of being kind of an asshole troll in his public life. It's like,
of course, the damn book had more meaning than that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. It's just more like the whole point is for you to think about it, not for me to tell you what the answer is.
Right, and that's what I kind of feel like with this too. It's like, this very much feels like that. Mm-hmm. I think I did mention it in Pulp Fiction with the briefcase.
Could be. I'm sure that you have brought it up before, and I think it what probably reminded me of then, which I'll say again now, is another fun line from Alfred Hitchcock where someone says, "You always put staircases in your movies. Like, what's the symbolism of all these stairs?" And he says, "Yes, I find that my characters occupy multi-level buildings, and it expedites their progress from floor to floor."
Right. Like it's that cynicism that's kind of funny. Of like, it's the same thing with this movie. Yeah, there's some meaning to this, but what you're left with is how you feel about it, how you interpret it is what the point is. Mm-hmm. There's not an answer to, oh my God, if you figure out what Kubrick was saying in that one scene, like you can meet God, like that's just like, that's absurd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So it's literally I was just going to say, it's literally about this, not that thing that you think it is. But my point is that from a filmmaking standpoint, it's intentionally ambiguous and is not intended to delineate some specific concrete story point.
Yes.
But you know,
My
that's
dinner is ready, so I hate
okay.
to cut it short,
Well,
but
so I think we've talked a lot about the movie. I think briefly, just uh, I can mention the awards. Start thinking about where you want to put those movies on the list, though. It did win for best special effects, which seems obvious. I mean, I guess I don't know what else it was up against, but it's hard to imagine what would have beat it at the time. And it was nominated for best director, best screenwriting, and best art direction, but it did not win any of those. So the only winner was for best visual effects.
okay. I know where I want to drop them, so
Okay.
I'm going to take them. I'm going to leave them in their same order, packaged together,
Okay.
and I'm going to take them below Taxi Driver, which I have at 24. So that would put 2001 at 25.
All right. Move those down. Okay. I am keeping 2001. Gosh. I'm just realizing that I was about to have it right next to another Kubrick movie, but that's kind of what's in my heart right now. Um,
Do it.
yeah, I
Do
mean,
it.
I'm not going to not put it where I was originally thinking just because it's two Kubrick movies, but it also feels a little bit weird to have my two favorite on the list also be Kubrick movies. But I'm leaving 2001 where it is.
Okay.
Um, Sunset Boulevard, I'm moving down a little further. Um, Not because it's not great, but there's just a lot of great movies on this list, so it doesn't, it doesn't have to stay at the top necessarily. I think I'm going to put it down. I'm going to go put it down after the Maltese Falcon, which is in the mid 30s.
I like it.
All right. So,
So I am going to. If I hang up, you can still keep talking, right?
okay, yes, you go ahead.
I'm gonna
I'll
hang
do
up.
our
You can talk
outro.
about what the next two movies are, and then
Yeah.
you and I can talk offline about when we want to watch them.
Yeah. All right.
Sorry about that.
Enjoy your dinner. Okay, so now we got just a nice little infinity corridor over there in the you know in the side of the screen. But yes, we my light keeps blinking at me over there. So that does it for number 16 and number 15, Sunset Boulevard, and 2001 A Space Odyssey. So next time on Watching 100 Movies, we will continue on to number 14 and number 13, which is an excellent pair of movies that I'm excited for. Psycho at number 14, and then Star Wars for number 13. And one of the things that I think is interesting about Star Wars is to just reflect that, of course, we'll be watching, the enhanced edition just because it's hard to find any other edition. But it does raise the question of like, when we have a movie that has multiple versions, what is the right one to talk about in this context? But we'll talk about that next time. So in the meantime, everybody, I know there's a lot of crazy stuff going on out there. So take care of yourself and make sure you're staying safe. And in the meantime, try to find time to watch some good movies. Good night.